Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be covering where to start when reading Stephen King. Now, I'm a big Stephen King fan and I've read plenty of books, but I have not read from start to finish. And I'm sure a lot of you people that are wanting to start, you're like, he's written over 70 novels. Where exactly do I start? Well, there's not exactly an exact order to start, but I will be giving some recommendations on what I think will make you a constant reader, just like these made me a constant reader. So if you haven't already, please drop a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on videos like this in the future. Let's go ahead and get started with number one, and of course, that is the start of it all, Carrie by Stephen King. Carrie is literally the first book that Stephen King ever published, and if it wasn't for this book, he wouldn't be who he is today. I would think he'd get published eventually, but if it wasn't for this specific novel at this specific time, he would not be the famous author that he is today. This was published in, when was this published? Carrie was released on April 5th of 1974, and it's crazy to think that this book is what it is today because Stephen King was about to trash this novel. And if it wasn't for his wife, Tabitha, we probably would have never seen the light of day of this novel, and thank God for that. The story is shown here. It says, Carrie was the odd one at school, the one whose reflexes were always off in games, whose clothes never really fit, who never got the point of a joke. And so she became the joke, the brunt of teenage cruelties that puzzled her as much as they wounded her. There was hardly any comfort in playing her private game because, like so many things in Carrie's life, it was sinful. Or so her mother said. Carrie could make things move by concentrating on them, by willing them to move. Small things like marbles would start dancing or a candle would fall, a door would lock. This was her game, her power, her sin, firmly repressed like everything else about Carrie. One act of kindness, as spontaneous as the vicious jokes of her classmates, offered Carrie a new look at herself the fateful night of her senior prom. But another act, of furious cruelty, and turned her clandestine game into a weapon of horror and destruction. She made a lighted candle fall, and she locked the doors. Carrie is a fantastic book, and I highly recommend anyone to read it. It is his first novel, so you will definitely see that he is starting to get his craft, so he's not as professional as he is in his future novels, but it still holds up today, and I highly recommend you try that book out. Coming up next at number 4, we have The Outsider, and this book here, look at that cover. This cover draws my attention every single time. It is fantastic. This book came out in 2018, and I absolutely loved every single second of it. If you watched my Holly review just a few days ago, you will know that this story focuses on Holly Gibney, as she is the leader of Finders Keepers in this book. But it focuses on a character at first it starts on a character named Terry Maitland, who was accused of brutally murdering this child. And Holly comes to find out that things aren't exactly what they seem, that there might possibly be a doppelganger involved because he was at one place while the person that killed the other that looked supposedly just like him was at the place of the crime scene. An 11-year-old boy's violated corpse is found in a town park. Eyewitnesses and fingerprints point unmistakably to one of Flint City's most popular citizens. He is Terry Maitland, Little League coach, English teacher, husband, and father of 2 girls. Detective Ralph Anderson, whose son Maitland once coached, orders a quick and very public arrest. The case seems ironclad, especially when Anderson and the district attorney are able to add DNA evidence to go with the fingerprints and witnesses. But Maitland has an alibi, and it turns out his story has incontrovertible evidence of its own. How can 2 opposing stories be true? What happens to a family when an accusation of this magnitude is delivered? When must reason or rationality be abandoned in order to explain the inexplicable? As the investigation expands and horrifying answers begin to emerge, King's propulsive story kicks into high gear, generating strong tension and almost unbearable suspense. Terry Maitland seems like a nice guy, but is he wearing another face? When the answer comes, it will shock as only Stephen King can. This book, I'm not lying, is fantastic, and it's one of his newer novels. A lot of people say that his newer work don't have that punch like they did in the original. Granted, I do understand there are a lot of novels that don't. This book packs a punch. It is disgusting, it is brutal, it is horrifying, it is scary, and I loved every second of this book. Next up at number 3, we have another classic, and that is Christine. This book is another fantastic novel. Of course, if you haven't seen the film by John Carpenter, this is the novel that came out the same exact year, I believe, and it was fantastic. Let's see when this came out. Now, Christine came out April 29th of 1983, and the movie actually came out the year after, but they were being worked on at the same time. John Carpenter was working on the script of the film, and at the same time that Stephen King was working on the manuscript of this book, which is really fantastic. That just goes to show just how popular Stephen King is. They're like, oh, Stephen King's making a new book. Let's work on a movie right now. We need to hurry up and get movie rights and get this movie started ASAP. Just another lover's triangle, you say? Not quite. There's a fourth here, the second lady, the dark lady. Cars are girls, Lee Cabot says, and the dark force in Stephen King's new novel is a 1958 Plymouth named Christine. She's no ordinary car. This white over red two-tone survivor of a time when high-test gasoline was priced at $0.25 a gallon, and speedometers were calibrated all the way up to 120 miles an hour, a time when rock and roll in all its first crude power ruled America, a time when speed was king. Arnie Cunningham is determined to have Christine at any price, and little by little, Dennis and Lee begin to suspect that the price of his growing obsession may be terrifyingly high. Its result, blackly evil. As Arnie sets feverishly to work on the seemingly hopeless job of restoring Christine, Christine begins to develop a terrible life of her own. Or is that only imagination? Dennis continues to hope so, and then people begin to die on the Libertyville's dark suburban streets and roads. And the time comes when Dennis can no longer deny the horrifying truth. Christine is alive. Now, Christine is a novel that takes a little bit to get started. I actually have tried reading it 2 times before I finished the novel, and it wasn't that it wasn't good. For some reason, it was paced a little bit slower than others, but the character development of Arnie and Dennis and Lee, they are all fantastic. And Christine as well. Christine is just as much as a character as the others. It is terrifying. And it's so crazy that Stephen King's like, I'm going to write a story about a killer car. Like, what? He was on some mad drugs back in the day, my friends. And this is proof of that. It is so cool, though. I love this book. It is very rock and roll. It is very greaser. And I just loved it. I highly recommend you all try it out, and don't give up on it because it ended up being a 5-star read for me. I like to grade mine in like letter grades, so this was an A+ for me through and through. Now, coming up at number 2 is a book that I hold very dear and close to my heart because it is actually the first Stephen King book that I've read and finished, and that is The Gunslinger. And it is part of the Dark Tower franchise, if you all don't know what that is. I may do a book on that. I may end up doing a video on that because the Dark Tower is one of the best fantasy series I've ever read. It is so wacky and weird and otherworldly. Considering, let's go ahead and go over one of the best lines of this book, and it is, there are other worlds than these. And that's proof in the pudding. This book came out in June of 1982, and this was originally serialized in a magazine, I believe. I don't know if it was through Playboy or what. I do know he did have a lot of short stories and stuff written through magazines like that. And I do really believe the first Dark Tower book was like that. The Gunslinger is going to be a tough read for a lot of people, but if you're like me, it was so confusing and wacky that I was like, I have to keep reading this franchise. A lot of people may be turned off by that, but the story of Roland from Gilead and in his story alone on the search for the tower, which he's not alone, he has a full quartet later down the road, but he is a fantastic character. He's one of the best fantasy characters ever, and I highly recommend, like, if you're a fantasy reader, check out the Dark Tower series. If you're not, if you want to get into horror, The Dark Tower is still a great series to read. This is just so much fun, and like I said, it is the first novel that I actually read. It confused the dog piss out of me because there's a part, like, they're in another world, but then all of a sudden someone's playing a Beatles song on piano in the saloon, and I'm like, what the hell's going on here? It was so fantastic. It's a fantastic fantasy series, and you all should definitely give it a shot. Last up, guys, at number 1 is probably one of the scariest Stephen King books out there, and that is Pet Sematary. This book came out in 1983, and this is, like I said, by far the scariest book I've ever read. It's not my favorite book, but it is still the scariest book I've ever read. And look at this freaking cover. Let's see here. Can you guys see that? Is it focusing? Oh my God. That is literally one of the coolest covers in the freaking world. And the scary thing about this, okay, here we go. And I'm sure a lot of people say this on BookTube, but when I first read this, I didn't have a kid. And it was scary because the cemetery, the pet cemetery, literally revives the corpses that you put into it and they come back. They're no longer dead. There's something else. And that was terrifying. But when you have a kid, it starts becoming something so much more than that. The scariest thing about this book, which is what I think the movies struggle to do, is because in the movies you're trying to see the pain, but the pain that you read with Lewis and him losing his child, the inner dialogue, the inner battle within himself on whether or not he should just let his son stay passed on or try to bring him back, that's the real horror of this story. I mean, he's literally, as he's digging up the body of his son, trying to convince himself, this isn't a major spoiler, but he's like basically telling himself that it's okay, that this is an okay thing to do. And it's insane. It's mind-bogglingly insane. And plus, guys, by the way, since this video came out, there's a new Pet Sematary movie, or it might be a series. I'm not sure. There's a new Pet Sematary out on one of the streaming platforms, and I'm going to be watching it probably tonight. And you all should too, because I heard that it's pretty good. But guys, I highly recommend you all check out Pet Sematary. It is terrifying in every single way, shape, or form, and you all will not be disappointed. But there you have it, guys. That is my list for where to start on reading Stephen King. I tried doing a mixture of classic books with newer books mixed in with a little bit of fantasy. I wanted to do it that way. I mean, of course, people will say start with these classics like The Shining and It. But god dang, guys, my favorite book is It, and it's over 1,300 pages long. Like, no one is going to start out reading Stephen King like that unless you're wanting to torture yourself. But I highly recommend you all check out every single one of these books. These are easy reads. They're very easy to go through, and you will not be disappointed in any of these. I do not think, unless you just have terrible taste. I'm kidding, guys. It's okay if you don't like these books, but I really hope you do, because they're some of my favorites. Let me know what other type of Stephen King book related videos you'd like to see in the future, and don't forget to drop a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on videos like this in the future. And until next time, take it easy, bubs.